What do we want from wine? I want to thank you for what you said. I felt excluded from wine and I didn't understand why. And what you said helped me to see why I felt that way, and now I feel like I can do something about it. A young woman said this to me after my presentation on the panel titled Beyond Vinifera at the Oregon Wine Symposium last week. Before I spoke, two scientists from Cornell University spoke about grape breeding and the sensory evaluation of new grapes, so I saw my role as bringing a big picture philosophical perspective. Why were we talking about hybrid grapes in the first place, and why was it important to wine, especially in Oregon? I don't live or work in Oregon, though an Oregon Pinot Noir I drank in college was the first wine that ever sparked curiosity in me to find out more about what it was and where it came from. I've traveled to Oregon for wine and other reasons many times now, and I spent the week before the symposium visiting with and talking to several producers to ask questions, listen, and try to understand their perspectives. First, it is undeniable, in my opinion, that some producers in Oregon make some of the most delicious expressions of Pinot Noir in the world. Oregon also has the highest percentage of organic, biodynamic, and regenerative vineyards in the U.S., as well as the most vineyards with other sustainability certifications like Salmon Safe or Deep Roots Coalition membership. Many wine growers in Oregon care deeply about producing wine in a way that doesn't degrade the health of the earth. They should be proud of this in the wines they produce, and I think they are proud in the best way. In trying to understand how to talk to Oregonians about hybrids then, I had to understand that this wine culture they have built over the last 40 plus years is like an intergenerational family. Sometime decades ago, some strangers met and had kids and built a home on a piece of land. Since then, their kids have had kids, and an entire community has grown up around their home. The younger generations don't see the two strangers who made the unprecedented decision to put down roots together. They see their grandparents. They see their family, their tribe. The novel decisions their grandparents made and the resulting ways of making a living in this land are now traditions, cultural anchor points for their own identities. It's extremely difficult to see outside of your own identity, and most of us seldom feel incentivized to get this outside perspective unless we experience crises that have significantly extreme impacts on us. Without crises, it's the rare person who would question their basic assumptions and challenge their fundamental understandings about what makes them who they are. These are things we all mostly take for granted. And so, in this analogy, hybrid grapes are like an outsider that questions things that aren't up for questioning. In some ways, I'm offering the solution to crises that, for Oregon, don't yet exist with enough acuteness for wine growers to question their membership in the Pinot Noir family. Family membership isn't a belief. It's not something you chose after careful reasoning. It just is. And that makes it all the harder to hear someone who tells you that you could be part of an entirely different family. This state of being transcends wine, of course. It's why big change of any kind is so hard. I say all this to be as fair as I can to everyone in wine, because these conditions exist across the global wine community. The understanding that I took into my presentation at the Oregon Wine Symposium was that Oregon wine growers make wine with the greatest amount of care that is possible for any wine on earth. They carry on a beautiful tradition, and they uphold that tradition with the highest level of skill and generations of accumulated knowledge. That doesn't mean that they have no blind spots, however. Oregon is one of the most monolithic wine monocultures on earth. 3 varieties of a single species of grape, Vitis vinifera, make up over 83% of all Oregon wine, and most of that is Pinot Noir. All of the risks inherent in a monoculture that we attempt to keep from adapting in a changing world apply to Oregon wine. To me, the question is not if, but when the grapes will hit the fan for a state who has tied its wine identity to a single grape variety. And while Oregonians largely care deeply about sustainability and therefore use sustainable practices to grow their wine, the grapes they grow aren't sustainable. Organic wine growers spray organically allowed fungicides an average of 10 to 12 times and sometimes more per season, or else their grapes and therefore their businesses will be severely impacted by mildews. That level of spraying would be considered unconscionable in most other forms of agriculture. Consider the positive impacts to vineyard worker health, soil health, environmental health, carbon footprints, and economic viability if you grew grapes that only needed to be sprayed once per year. Consider the industries you'd defund. Consider the time you'd get back to do things like enjoy a stroll through the vineyard, have a glass of wine with your partner, or spend time with your kids. Now, to be fair, the biggest cost to vineyards is all of the other labor besides spraying. And even if you didn't have to spray fungicides, you might spray some foliar nutrients or compost teas. But wouldn't it be great, especially at this point in wine history, to save even a little time, money, and wear and tear on the earth? How would it alter your psychology to work with grapes that gave you peace of mind rather than constant worry, whose treatment with anything was optional and flexible rather than obligatory and urgent? In addition to these areas of concern for Oregon, I found that when I pushed on some of the philosophical undergirding of this way of doing wine, there were unspoken beliefs in the superiority of Pinot Noir specifically and Vinifera generally as a wine grape that gives us what we want from wine grapes. But even if, for the sake of argument, we say that Pinot Noir or any other of the popular Vinifera varieties embodies the greatest potential for wine flavor, I would insist that we add up to now. To think that this is the best that will ever be possible for wine seems incredibly unlikely. Wine must and will evolve. This brings me to the perspective I shared that led to this young attendee feeling seen in wine for the first time. When considering how we can move forward in wine, I think it's really important to ask, why do we wine? I mean, what is wine for? What do we get out of wine? Like most things, there are many answers to why, but I can propose a selection of the most likely and important reasons for wine. I've updated and added to this list since my presentation, but the gist remains the same. Wine gives us sensual pleasure and deliciousness. It gives us intoxication and social lubrication, preservation of calories and nutrition, goods for commerce and trade. It gives us a medicinal and sacramental medium, creative and artistic expression, tradition and cultural history, and it gives us fanaticism and tribalism, as well as status and class creation and enforcement. All of these reflect common human needs or psychological conditions. But as we look at this list, do any of these reasons need to be limited to a single grape species? Do they even need to be limited to grapes? Only the last two, fanaticism and status creation, require that we identify the specific fruit and then the specific type of that fruit so that we can create in-groups and out-groups, us and them distinctions. This is how the belief in the superiority of Vitis vinifera functions in our wine culture and creates what I refer to as vinifera culture. We say things like, quote-unquote, fine wine and quote-unquote, noble grapes, and we promote a kind of wine culture in which the French names we use for grape varieties serve as passwords of initiation into the wine club. If you don't know or care to use these passwords, you're welcome to drink the boxes and bottles on the lower shelves that have cute pictures and silly names in the language that people like you speak. It almost seems incidental that this class that we create and enforce with vinifera culture comes from historic prejudice and aligns with the dominant cultures that colonized the places where we now make wine. The more basic and primary human tendency to exclude others in an attempt to make ourselves feel special precedes and informs colonization and the cultures that followed from it. There may have been a time when exclusivity and in-group status was an experience that we wanted from wine. But I don't know how important that is to what we want from wine anymore. Does this kind of exclusion serve wine in the 21st century, or does it hold it back? Yes, we have a human need to feel important and meaningful, but maybe we can get that from being the best at ecological integration rather than through grape chauvinism. This is why I've said in the past that I don't think we can make wine as it is less snobby. The only reason for a wine culture built exclusively around the single European grape that we keep quote-unquote racially pure on a planet of 80 species of grapes that intercross anytime they grow near each other is to create tribalism and to enforce class. Otherwise, we wouldn't even need to speak about hybrids. Some Europeans originally referred to the crossing of Vitis vinifera with other grape species as miscegenation. They outlawed the impure children that resulted from these crossings and went to great lengths and cost to eradicate them from European vineyards in the 20th century. I think this is at the heart of the unwillingness to legitimize hybrid grapes or any other kind of wine. The definition of wine that forms the basis of our current globally dominant wine culture is rooted in a way of seeing the world that grew from this kind of exclusionary perspective on wine. What I don't think the people within the dominant definition get is that we have begun seeing wine completely differently. This really is a revolution in perspective, a cultural revolution. We don't care what the colonial subjects and sycophants of the wine establishment deem to be acceptable. We don't care about their definition anymore because we realize they never had the authority to define wine for the rest of the world in the first place. When you stop caring about the status experience that Vinifera offers, when you cease to care about being admitted into the fan club, and I think the younger generations have completely stopped caring about this, then what you want from wine begins to shift. Why we do wine can't continue to be about preserving someone else's culture that we have been told is the best that can ever be, yet that fails in some of the most basic ecological ways because it has ceased to adapt. What if we began to envision wine as a dynamic process of adaptation rather than a preservation of a hangover from European chauvinism that literally couldn't exist if it didn't grow on hybrid rootstock and get sprayed a dozen times per season? What if we built a tradition of adaptation rather than continuing to grow and celebrate the same handful of varieties of a single species of grape at any cost and ad nauseum? What if we invested our resources and time into continually breeding the next generation's grapes, rather than developing the pesticides that will sicken the next generation because we need to keep our maladapted varieties productive? Hybrids aren't a few marginalized and stigmatized grape varieties. They aren't a class of grapes that we can talk about as if they all have the same qualities. Again, the only reason we have to talk about them at all is because of how weirdly vinifera exclusive the dominant wine culture is. It really isn't about hybrids. Hybrid grapes represent our choice to see wine as an ecological process. Hybridization is the primary ecological way we can embrace the desperately needed process of adaptation in wine. Letting our real ecological needs determine the way that we begin to build, or in some cases rebuild, our own indigenous wine culture is how we can re-envision wine that is globally distinct, that imitates no one, that needs no one's permission to be delicious, and that leads the way on celebrating the diverse expressions of unique local beauty that wine has the potential to be.